not an official report. I've filed those. The case is closed, technically. 7 deaths across Kalder County, all ruled cardiac events, all listed as coincidental, all quietly forgotten by everyone with authority over such things. I signed the final paperwork in November. I handed in the recording equipment the same afternoon. There are 7 victims in that report, and the medical examiner's notes on each of them are clean and final. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. Contributing factors none identified. Manner natural. I reviewed those notes for months before I accepted that the word natural was doing more work than it could hold. But that's not what I'm writing down. What I'm writing down is this: all 7 victims died moving toward the same place. The same GPS coordinate. Same field, same bearing, same direction. Like something had called them, and they had answered. That coordinate is 8 miles from the nearest town. There is no road, no structure, no landmark at those coordinates. There is a field. Knee-high grass in the summer, hard clay underneath. Nothing. I've been to that field once. In May, I stayed until after dark. I drove home with the windows down because I needed the cold air, and I didn't ask myself too carefully why I needed it. That's the part that's not in the official report. My name is Nolan Marsh. I worked investigative homicide for 14 years. Before Kalder County, I'd worked missing persons, fraud, 2 federal task forces. I say this not to establish credentials, but because I want you to understand the kind of mind I brought to this. I was not someone who filled in gaps with imagination. I was someone who filled gaps with facts, or left them empty and documented the absence. That was my method. That was what I was good at. The first file came to my desk in March. A man named Franklin Osei, 44, found dead in a field outside the town of Heron's Bluff. No signs of struggle. No drugs in his system. The medical examiner noted cardiac arrest. Sudden, severe, no prior history of heart disease. Franklin had been healthy. He had run half marathons. He was, by every measurable standard, a man whose heart had no reason to stop. What made it a case, rather than a tragedy, was where he was found. His car was in his driveway. His house was locked from the inside. He was found 2.5 miles away, in a field, barefoot, wearing the clothes he'd gone to bed in. He had walked in his sleep before, his wife told me, but never far, never more than to the kitchen. The second death came 6 weeks later. A woman named Clara DeVos, 51, found 3 miles from her home, also barefoot. Also cardiac arrest. Her husband said she'd been complaining of headaches for a few days before she died. And something else. He hesitated when he said this, a sound. She'd mentioned a sound, low, steady, like something left running in the basement. Except they didn't have a basement. The third victim was a retired postal worker named Martin Greer, 63, who had worked the same rural route for 30 years and knew every mailbox between Heron's Bluff and the county line. He was found in a field 3 miles from his house on a Tuesday morning in late June, the grass around him bent and damp. His wife told me he'd been complaining about a sound for 3 days. She thought it was the refrigerator. She'd called an appliance repair company the day before he died. The fourth was a woman named Ruth Ames, 49, a school secretary. Her daughter told me Ruth had mentioned the sound to 3 separate people in the 8 hours before she died, not in alarm, in curiosity, like something's running somewhere, she'd said. I can't find it. She'd searched the house twice. She'd checked the neighbors' properties. She came back inside satisfied that whatever it was would stop eventually. It didn't stop. The 5th and 6th victims died within 4 days of each other. A landscape contractor and a retired teacher, found within a half-mile of each other in the same field at the eastern edge of Kalder County. I noted their locations on a county map. I kept above my desky 7 X marks, each one a death, each one connected by a dotted red line to that same central GPS coordinate. When I stepped back and looked at the map, the lines looked like something reaching inward or drawing outward, depending on how you looked at it. I looked at it both ways for several weeks. By the time the 7th person died, I had been assigned the case full time. By then I had 5 different medical examiners' reports, 46 witness interviews, and a growing list of things that didn't fit. I spent 6 weeks on the pattern before I was willing to call it a pattern. 7 is a small number if you're working a fraud case. 7 people dying of cardiac arrest in 18 months in a county of 40,000 is within statistical norms. The medical examiners said so. 3 separate consultants said so. I had a supervisor who said so twice in writing before she stopped saying it. What made it a pattern wasn't the number, it was the sound. That one specific detail, mentioned by family members of 6 of the 7 victims, that I found buried in interview notes I'd transcribed myself and then passed over for weeks. Not one family had flagged it as significant. Not one medical examiner had heard it at all. It was there in the transcripts the way small things are there when you go back and look ordinary until it isn't. Here's what all 7 had in common. They had each, in the 72 hours before their death, mentioned a sound to someone, a hum, low, below the ordinary threshold of annoyance, more felt than heard, one husband said. Like standing next to a generator, except there's no generator. Like the feeling of bass through a floor, except there's no music. They had all reported it. They had all dismissed it. And then they had walked, in the night, toward that field. None of them made it all the way. 6 of the 7 were found within a mile of the field's edge. Franklin Osei, the first one, was found closest, 200 yards from the center of that GPS coordinate. He had walked the farthest. I noted that in the case file. I didn't know yet what it meant. The infrasound angle came from an archival search I almost didn't run. I had been working the case for 6 weeks when I found a reference, buried in a county environmental report from 1991, to a research facility called the Hargrove Acoustics Laboratory. It had operated, briefly, between 1983 and 1988, on land that was now the southeastern edge of Calder County, government-funded. Officially, it had studied low-frequency sound propagation in geological formations. Officially, it had closed due to budget cuts. The unofficial record took me 3 weeks to locate. What I can tell you is that it took 3 weeks, 2 FOI requests, and 1 phone call to a retired county archivist named Gerald Foss, who remembered the facility from when he was young and had, for reasons he didn't explain, kept a copy of the original site registration papers in his personal files. Gerald was 81. He gave me the papers without hesitation. He said, "I always thought someone would come asking. Eventually. I wrote that down at the time and thought nothing of it. I would think about it later. I eventually obtained 11 boxes of archived materials from the Hargrove Project, including internal memos, research logs, and 1 item that had been separately sealed and labeled by hand, a cassette tape, masking tape on the case. Written in blue ballpoint, Sessision 11, do nauti dello pieti. I set the tape aside. I started with the documents. What infrasound is, in simple terms, is sound below the range of human hearing. Below 20 hertz. You can't hear it consciously. Not most of it, but your body responds to it. Depending on frequency and amplitude, exposure can cause disorientation, anxiety, visual disturbances, nausea. Sustained exposure at specific frequencies has been linked to cardiac arrhythmia. The frequency the Hargrove researchers were studying was 18.98 hertz. They found it in the geological formation below the field, a natural resonant cavity, a void in the limestone. They believed that produced and amplified this frequency under certain barometric conditions. The lab was built to measure it, to understand it. I read the full Hargrove archive in order, chronologically, over the course of 3 evenings in that archive room. The early records were the records of meticulous people doing careful work. Frequency readings logged at 4-hour intervals. Equipment calibration notes. Environmental conditions documented in triplicate. Hargrove's handwriting in those early files was small and even. The handwriting of a man trained to keep what he was thinking inside the boundaries of what he could measure. The middle period, 1985 through early 1986, was when things began to shift in small ways. Nothing dramatic, a note here or there, about anomalous environmental readings that didn't correspond to instrument malfunction. A brief mention of persistent low-frequency environmental noise of unknown origin in a monthly summary that was otherwise routine. The kind of language that means something happened that we don't have a word for yet, so we're using the closest word we have. Their early reports were scientific and precise. The writing of people who believed they were studying a geological curiosity. The later reports were different. The lead researcher, a man named Dr. Paul Hargrove, began noting anomalies in November of 1986. Equipment readings that didn't match known parameters. Frequency variations that occurred independently of barometric pressure, without identifiable cause. He noted that 2 of his staff had reported hearing something during off hours, when all equipment was powered down. He was careful about how he wrote this. He used the word perceive rather than hear. In February of 1987, Dr. Hargrove wrote, "The frequency has not been absent from the site since December 14th. We have verified this 3 times. The equipment is not malfunctioning. The equipment is off." The last entry in his formal research log was dated April 3, 1988. It read, It answers back now. I've read that sentence perhaps 300 times since I found it. What I keep returning to is not what it says. It says plenty. But what it doesn't say what eat is. It doesn't say what answering back meant specifically to a man with 30 years of acoustics research behind him. It doesn't say whether he was afraid. It says only that something had changed in the nature of the relationship, and that he considered the change significant enough to record and significant enough to be the last thing he chose to document. That's the sentence a scientist writes when the science has ended and something else has begun. The facility was closed 4 months later. The official reason given was, as I said, budget cuts. I sat with those files for a long time in the silence of the county archive room. The fluorescent light above me buzzed. My coffee had gone cold without me noticing. I kept thinking about that phrase. It answers back now, not as a claim of discovery, as a statement about something that had been listening. I remembered the cassette tape. I had a handheld player in my kit. Old habit. County evidence protocol still ran on it. I took the tape out of its case. Something I noticed, holding it, the tape itself was intact, full reel, unused, looking on the outside. But the label had been written in a different ink than the other archive labels. Darker, pressed harder into the tape. Someone had labeled this separately from the rest. Someone had wanted it noted. I pressed play. For a moment, nothing. Then, very low, very far below the threshold of what I can properly describe as sound, something. Not music, not speech. A tone. A presence in the frequency below frequency. My teeth, I remember, felt strange. My molars. That particular unpleasant vibration you get sometimes near certain machinery, except there was no machinery. I stopped the tape after 40 seconds. I told myself it was the old recording equipment. Tape hiss. Environmental noise from 1987 picked up by a sensitive microphone. I put the tape back in its case. I went home and I slept. And in the morning I felt fine. And I told myself the feeling had already passed. Dr. Vera Calloway had been a junior acoustic researcher at the Hargrove Lab from 1985 to 1987. She'd left the project before its closure. According to the records, she had resigned. I found her living alone about 40 miles from Kalder County. When I called, she picked up on the second ring. "I'm glad you called," she said. "I've been expecting someone to eventually." She invited me to come by the following afternoon. She seemed, on the phone, composed, unsurprised. The kind of calm that's either confidence or resignation. I couldn't tell which yet. Her house was a small, neat place at the end of a gravel road. She met me at the door. 70, maybe 72, sharp eyes. The posture of someone who had spent decades being precise. In the hallway, I noticed this immediately, and I noticed details. A pair of walking boots, muddy, recently used. The mud was still soft. She hadn't offered any information about where she'd been. I didn't ask. Not yet. She confirmed what the records had suggested. The Hargrove project had begun as a legitimate scientific inquiry. They had found the resonant cavity. They had studied the frequency. And somewhere in the 3rd year of the project, something had shifted. We used to joke about it, she said, that we were calling something up. You know how researchers talk. Ironic detachment from what you're doing. It keeps the work from feeling strange. A pause. Then it stopped feeling like a joke. I asked what changed, she said. The frequency changed. Not the reading, the experience of it. The first 2 years, it felt like ambient noise, like standing near a highway. By the end, it felt directed, like it was looking for something specific, or like it had learned that we were there and started trying to understand us the way we were trying to understand it. I wrote that down carefully. I was still, at that point, looking for a rational framework. Before I asked about the tape, I asked her why she had left the project. The question landed quietly. She looked at her tea for a moment. I left in March of 1987, she said. Before the last entries. Before Paul's. She paused. I left because of a dream I had. I know how that sounds. But the dream was very specific. I was in the lab chamber, the one below the field, and I was listening through the headphones, the way we always did, routine monitoring, and what I heard in the headphones was my own voice, not recorded, my own voice speaking, and I wasn't speaking. I was listening, and what my voice was saying in the headphones was my name. She picked up her tea and set it back down. It was a dream, she said. I've told myself that for 37 years, but I submitted my resignation the next morning. I drove back to the lab to collect my personal things, and I didn't go below ground. I drove away, and I didn't look at the field. Not once. Not as I was leaving. There was a long pause in her kitchen. Do you still dream about it? I asked. No, she said. After a moment, not the same one. I want to stop here for a second. If you're listening to this in the dark right now, that might have been a strange thing to hear. Not the same one. If you want to know where this ends, stay with me. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if this is the kind of story you've been looking for, there are more where this came from every week. I asked her about the cassette tape. Session 11. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "That was Paul's. He recorded it himself the last week of the project. He wanted proof, independent audio evidence, something he could show people." She looked at her hands. He told me he'd heard it speak, not in words, in the structure of the sound. He said it had started reflecting, like an echo, except what came back wasn't what he'd sent. I asked her what she thought of that. I think Paul was a brilliant man who spent 3 years in close proximity to something that had no interest in being understood, she said. I think whatever he thought he heard was real. Whether the thing that produced it was what he believed it to be, that I can't say. I went to the field that afternoon. I've driven past a lot of empty fields in my career. I've stood in fields after dark waiting for things that didn't come, and in fields where they did. I'm not a person who is unsettled by ordinary emptiness. This was not ordinary emptiness. The field was about 200 acres of knee-high grass, and at its center, roughly the GPS coordinate, where all 7 paths converged, the ground sloped almost imperceptibly downward, 4 or 5 inches of grade over a wide radius. You wouldn't notice it walking in. You'd only notice it standing still, looking. Underneath, according to the geological survey I'd obtained by then, was the resonant cavity, a limestone void, roughly 20 feet deep, 60 feet across. Natural formation, millions of years old. The Hargrove facility had been above it. The structure was gone now, cleared, according to county records, in 1992. But the subterranean infrastructure remained. Concrete walls, a ventilation system, an acoustic monitoring chamber sealed. I stood at the center of the field. Grass moved around me. Wind from the northwest. Normal temperature for early May. And then, for just a moment, low, below where I could name it. Something. My back teeth ached. My hands, before I registered any conscious thought, had gone still. I've written down what I noticed at that field, and I've reread it many times. What I wrote in my notes was grass in radial bend pattern from center point. No wind direction to account for it. Ground slightly lower at center, 4 to 5 inches grade, roughly 80-foot radius. Old ventilation grading at ground level. Partially overgrown, approximately 40 feet northwest of center. Sound intermittent sub-auditory. Onset approximately 6 minutes after arrival. Duration of each onset 8 to 15 seconds. Onset frequency irregular. What I didn't write down, because case notes are for what you observe, not for what you feel, was the quality of the sound. Not its frequency, its intention. I am a methodical person. I don't use words like intention in case notes. I'm using it now because I've been trying for 7 months to find a better word, and I haven't found one. I stayed until the light changed. The sound, if it was sound, came and went. Not rhythmically, not on a schedule. More like a signal being tested. A frequency adjusting to find its range. I told myself it was the wind through the grass. Through the vents of whatever remained of the facility beneath me, I told myself that clearly and deliberately, standing in the center of the field at dusk. I drove home with the windows down. For 3 weeks after the field, I ran 2 parallel investigations. The first was methodical. I brought in a geological survey team, under the cover of an environmental assessment, to map the resonant cavity in detail. I contacted 2 acoustic physicists at separate universities, without telling them about each other or about the deaths. I asked them, clinically, whether 18.98 Hz at significant amplitude could produce the following cardiac disruption, disorientation, directed movement in a sleeping subject. Both said yes. Both said it would require sustained exposure at levels far above what ambient geological production typically generates. I asked, could the old facility's infrastructure act as an amplifier? The first physicist said possibly, under very specific conditions. The second said yes, given the geometry described, definitely. So that's the first theory. A geological infrasound source. The resonant cavity beneath the field, amplified periodically by atmospheric pressure differentials interacting with the old facility's ventilation and acoustic infrastructure. The victims, each with minor undiagnosed cardiac irregularities. Something I confirmed in their medical histories. A single shared variable I had missed in the first pass. were vulnerable to its effects. The sleep, walking, the movement toward the source, a documented physiological response to sustained infrasound exposure. The body orients toward the source. Why, exactly, is still debated. But it happens. There's literature. My perception of the sound at the field's stress, sleep deprivation, expectation. The power of context. I had spent months reading about a low hum. I stood in a field where people had died. My brain filled in what it expected to find. Dr. Calloway's muddy boots, she takes walks. She lives in the countryside. Dr. Calloway's dream. The product of sustained workplace stress and the particular anxiety of working close to a psychoacoustic phenomenon her field couldn't yet explain. Researchers in unusual environments have unusual dreams. That's documented too. Session 11's in old tape. 60-year-old equipment. Ambient noise misread by a fatigued researcher who had already decided something unusual was happening. It answers back now. The late career notes of a man who had been working in isolation, without peer review, in proximity to a phenomenon that the science of 1988 did not fully understand. A man who was, by the end, hearing things. This is the explanation that lets me sleep, or it was for a while. In the weeks after the field, I found myself thinking often about the third victim. A woman named Sable Okonkwo, 38, a high school music teacher. Her sister told me something I had recorded and transcribed, and then not known what to do with for months. Sable, in the 48 hours before her death, had started noticing silences differently. Not the presence of a sound, the absence of the sounds she was used to. The fridge hum stopping before she turned it off. Birds outside her classroom window going quiet mid-morning for no weather-related reason. Her sister said Sable had said, "It's like the world is making room for something." She had said it lightly, like an observation, not a warning. I wrote it in my notes the first time as a curiosity. I wrote it the second time, after the field, differently. If you're still here, I think you understand why I can't let this go. Subscribe if you haven't. New stories every week. And this next part is the part I've sat with the longest. The second theory goes like this. The resonant cavity is real. The facility was real. The research was real. But the frequency the researchers found was not a geological accident. It was a signal. Already present. Already old. And the facility. The instruments, the recordings, the 3 years of careful study had taught something to recognize human attention, not human presence, not bodies in a field. Attention, the act of listening. Dr. Hargrove's log, it answers back now. He wrote that after 3 years of study, after 3 years of sustained, focused human engagement with a frequency that had existed, presumably, for geological time, something had changed in year 3. Not the frequency. Something in the relationship between the frequency and the people studying it. Dr. Calloway had said, "It started trying to understand us." She had said that first. I thought about that. She hadn't said we came to understand it better. She'd said it started trying to understand us. If that framing is accurate, then what happened next makes a different kind of sense. After the facility closed, the studying stopped. The attention withdrew. Whatever had been in contact with the researchers was, presumably, no longer being listened to. 35 years passed, then 7 people. For reasons that could be coincidence. A local news story about electromagnetic sensitivity that Sable Okonkwo had forwarded to her sister. A county environmental report that Franklin Osei had read for reasons connected to his work in land surveying. 7 people became briefly, incidentally aware of a sound, an unusual sound, low, below the range of naming. They mentioned it to their families. They tried to explain it. They were listening. And when they started listening, something that had been waiting a long time found their frequency. I have spent considerable time trying to decide which of these I believe. The honest answer is that both are possible. Both explain the deaths. Both account for the evidence. Neither can be disproved. And I am not a man who is comfortable with that. I submitted my final report in November. I recommended that the field and its surrounding acreage be fenced and posted. Environmental hazard, I wrote. Geological instability. I used the infrasound research to support this. The real research. The kind that would survive peer review. I recommended that the ventilation infrastructure of the former Hargrove facility be sealed permanently. The county board approved the recommendation in 2 weeks. That was faster than anything I'd ever had approved in 14 years. I don't know if they knew what they were approving, or if they were just grateful to have a reason that fit on a form. Either way, the field was fenced in December. Wire and concrete pylons. A hazard sign at each entrance point. There have been no deaths since. I went back to the office the day after the board meeting and sat at my desk for an hour without opening anything. It was the first time in 11 months that I had nothing to do on this case. No interview to schedule, no archive to search, no physicist to call. The case had generated 460, 2 pages of notes and 1 hour of interview recordings, and I had submitted all of it in a document that recommended a fence and a geological survey. It felt like too small an ending for a thing this large. I think about that sometimes, whether the smallness of the official ending was a feature or a problem. Whether the board's weak approval speed meant they already understood what they were approving, or whether it meant they were just grateful for any answer that would let them stop asking the question. I don't know. I filed the report. I went home. I slept that first night better than I had in months, which is its own kind of data, I suppose. The week before I submitted the final report, I had the cassette tape sent to an audio analysis lab in the city. I asked them to transcribe any audio content, characterize any frequencies present, and note any anomalies in the recording. The lab's standard turnaround was 2 weeks. I marked it urgent. The lab called me back 12 days later. I was in the waiting room of a different building. Unrelated case. When my phone rang. The technician's name was Yara. I remember that clearly because I remember everything about that phone call. She said, "We reviewed the tape. Both sides, full playback, spectral analysis. There's nothing on it." A pause. Complete silence. No signal at all. The recording head was never engaged, as far as we can tell. I said. You're sure? She said. We ran it twice. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you were hoping for. I said thank you. I said I understood. I was already on the phone with her when I realized what I was hearing. In that waiting room, in the ordinary fluorescent silence of a government building at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, low, below the threshold of naming, below the frequency of anything that had a right to be there. My molars, my hands going still before I thought to make them. I hadn't been to the field in 6 weeks. I finished the call. I sat in that plastic chair for a long time. The sound, the frequency, the presence, whatever word fits, came and went twice more before it stopped. No one else in the room looked up. I thought about that no one else looked up. Not that I expected them to. Whatever I was hearing, if I was hearing it, had nothing to do with the 3 other people in that waiting room. A woman reading a magazine, a man in a work uniform watching his phone, a teenager with headphones on, asleep against the wall. Whatever it was had, apparently, no interest in them. I've thought about what that means since November. That specificity, 5 months since the last death, 6 weeks since the field, a waiting room in a city building, 42 miles from Kalder County. That's the part that doesn't fit either theory. I haven't been back to the field. The case is closed. I have taken to noticing, when I'm in quiet buildings, what the silence sounds like, whether it has texture, whether it is merely the absence of sound, or something with a shape. Most of the time, it's just silence. Most of the time. I don't know what the Hargrove researchers found. I know they found something. I know that it was real enough to close a government facility, to seal the records, to leave a cassette tape in an archive with a handwritten label that someone felt needed to say, "Do not duplicate." I know that Paul Hargrove kept working after the lab closed. I found 3 boxes of personal notes, mailed to a storage unit he maintained under his wife's maiden name, full of measurements taken at the field after hours. After the official project ended, he was still listening. He couldn't stop. He died in 2004. Natural causes. He was 61. I've thought about him often since November. What he must have felt standing in that field alone, with equipment that nobody had authorized, trying to hear something that had already decided whether it wanted to be heard. That's the thing about listening for something you can't name. You can't know, when you hear it, whether you found it, or whether it found you. The field is fenced now. The pylons are set. The hazard signs are posted. But here is the thing I think about, in the quiet moments before sleep. A fence is a statement about geography. It marks a boundary. It says this is where a thing is, and this is where it isn't. Whatever is beneath that field, geological anomaly or something older, something that learned to listen while we were learning to measure, has been there for geological time, before the facility, before the county, before anyone walked across that grass and felt their teeth go strange and didn't know why. A fence doesn't end something like that. A fence just decides where the official boundary of the question is. If this kept you with me until now, thank you. New stories every week. Subscribe so you don't miss where this goes next. Turn off the lights if they're still on. The tape was blank. That's what the lab said. Complete silence. I heard it playing before I picked up the call. Sleep well.